who sees the European Union as one of the world's great powers capable of defending itself from external threats, including through military means? Well, it turns out not many Europeans. Only 18% of those asked in a recent ECFR poll said they want Europe to be that power. In fact, almost all of the countries we polled, from Germany to Sweden, Hungary to Italy, the great military power option was the least popular. Only one country is an outlier. In France, defense is seen as a #1 priority. But maybe what Europeans would prefer doesn't actually matter as much as the global reality. And this reality is slowly dawning on us. In another survey question, a clear majority of Europeans note that Europe can't always rely on the United States. We need to look after our own defense capabilities. So maybe there's more change in the air than one may think. And this is clearly an area of future focus for us as Europeans and for us at ECFR.
And with my wonderful colleague Ulrike Franke, I welcome you to this morning session. As I said, I promise you this will be amazing. We will be like a strong morning coffee, very energizing and hopefully not too dark. And I'm very happy to welcome my two excellent speakers on the panel, the Defense Minister of Portugal, João Cravinho, and the Secretary General of the European External Action Service, Stefano Sannino. And I couldn't have wished for two better speakers. So the EU is currently drafting or fine-tuning a strategic compass to give direction to the EU's role as a security and defense actor. And we want to talk about what the EU's ambition should be in that regard, especially in relation to NATO, because once you have a compass, you also need to know where you want to go for the compass to show you the way. NATO is equally undergoing a strategic review process, the strategic concept process, and the strategic concept is to be presented next year at the Madrid summit. And so I want to talk with you about these two processes, about the concepts behind it, and basically about European defense and security and the role that Europeans can play in the world and in international security. And we give both speakers now the opportunity to warm us up with not more than 5 minutes introductory remarks, and then we go into questions. And I encourage you in the audience, of course, but also those people that follow us online to ask questions, and I'll pick them up then later. Defense Minister, if you would like to kick us off.
Great, be delighted to. Thank you very much, Jana. It's nice to be here with you, and of course with you as well, Stefano, and with all of those in the room and online. So a little bit about where we are with the strategic compass. I think that having been very much involved over the past couple of years in this process, the initial debates were all about, can we be ambitious or do we have to be realistic? And there was this juxtaposition between the two. And what was very interesting was that during this year, during 2020, the first half of 21, the first half of the year, really there was a crystallization of the idea that no, we need to have both. And in fact, more than that, it is actually not realistic not to be ambitious at this moment. This is what we really need to do. And the document that has been produced, the first draft, I think is a very good first draft. But obviously it can still be improved, which is fine because we have a few months and we have a few more drafts ahead of us. But then there is, of course, the question of, once we have a document, is it just going to be another document, or will it actually transform the way that we work as EU? And these two questions, of course, the two issues of improving, fine-tuning, finalizing the document, and whether it will be operational are connected, but they also have their own dynamics. A couple of points briefly on where I think we can improve. Maritime security is insufficiently worked on, and I think that it's really a little bit of a reflection that Europe is still very much a continental continent, if you excuse the redundancy of the terms, but it's still a bit focused on the land realities, whereas, of course, we are all aware that every European, as far as he or she may be from the sea, is deeply dependent on sea transport, on the digital world, which comes to us through the sea lines, undersea lines, and we need to have much greater capacity of projection of maritime power. In my view, that needs to be strengthened in the documents. And another aspect related to that is that we need to, as EU, be focusing on support on defending access to the global commons. Nobody else is going to be doing that if the EU doesn't do that. And it's mentioned in various points in the document, but on the other hand, is there any more important global commons than the sea? And that is not sufficiently worked on. So, sea, maritime security. On partnerships, also we need to go further, we need to go deeper. As defense minister over the past 3 years, I've been struck by how much we talk about Africa and how little we talk with Africans. There is clearly a big lack of connection there, and this is obviously going to be costly in terms of our effectiveness, and it has been. We have been much less effective than we should be in the continent where we invest most in terms of our EU mission. So I would like to see the document much stronger in terms of how we work with African sub-regional organizations. And then there is, I think, a greater need to focus on priorities. You know, when the whole world is a priority, really nothing is a priority. This is complicated because with 27 member states, everyone would draw up a different list of priorities. So I understand the need for some generalizations, some ambiguities, but in practice we need to be ensuring that we are focusing on what are, in my view, the most significant priorities, which are the regions closest to us, the ones from which threats and vulnerabilities for the European come. I think that, but these, at the end of the day, these are relatively minor fine-tuning operations that we can do. I think underlying the whole document, though, is still a hesitancy to project power, to use power. One example, when one looks at cyber, or one looks at disinformation, the way it's dealt with, there is an identification of our so-called toolboxes, you know, collections of instruments that we can deploy. Deploy for what? Deploy for protecting ourselves, deploy for resilience, deploy for making us less vulnerable to cyber attacks or to attacks from disinformation. But actually, that's very good, of course. What we really need is the capacity to be punitive, the capacity to say, if anybody does cyber attack us, does spread disinformation, does undermine our values, they will be sorry. And there's nothing about that. There is only toolboxes to defend ourselves. And I think that goes to a deeper mindset about how we think, how we use power in the European Union. And I think that's not so much a question of fine-tuning, it's really about developing a way of thinking about the use of power. On this point, actually, I'd like to welcome the European Commission's recent announcement of an instrument to combat economic coercion. I think that's a very significant move. I would like to see that instrument, or that kind of instrument, available for not just for economic coercion, but actually for being precisely the kind of punitive capacity that we need. And of course, you know, I know that this brings up issues with respect to the World Trade Organization, with respect to a number of the rule systems with which we are engaged. But ultimately, this is where we should be heading. We should be looking at the capacity to use where we do really have clout in the economic field for the purpose of defending ourselves geostrategically. And we don't really have that connection made so far in the document. Finally, just to finalize, I thought a couple of times when reading the document about a professor, a wonderful lady who I studied with, called Susan Strange. And whenever we use the term political will, we would say there was no political will. She would say, no, scratch that. I don't want you to hear about political will, because when you talk about political will, you are actually hiding much deeper interests, dynamics. It's just an excuse to say political will. We need to be focusing on what the problems are, what the real interests and dynamics are that do not allow us to have this so-called political will. And I think that we're a little bit too generous, too condescending with ourselves when we talk about, well, you know, of course we would all like to do this, but we don't have the political will. No, there are real issues, real problems. And when we come to, in a couple of years' time, the annual reports, the moments when we're making assessments of where we are, then we need to go deeper than just say political will. We need to be saying, no, there are real problems that are impeding us and attack those problems. So that's my reading on the strategic compass. Thank you, Jana.
Thank you very much. And we come to the concept and relationship with NATO later in the discussion. Yeah. Secretary General, you have been watching the process closely, the drafting process that started already a while ago. And maybe while you are giving us your assessment, you could also let us in some little secrets. So what were the major problems? What were kind of the most disputed topics? And how was a compromise found?
Thanks, and maybe I would like to start from where the minister just ended about the fact of political will or assessment of the problems that are behind it. And that, I think it's important to understand why we have come now to the strategic compass and why we are talking about this problem or this issue better. And I think that we need maybe to take a few steps back and think about, let's say, the string of crises that we have gone through in the last 15 years, essentially, starting back with the economic and financial crisis, with the security crisis, terrorist attacks, with the migration crisis, Brexit, and now what we are going through, the health crisis, which have all, let's say, tested the capacity of the European Union to react to all this, because they have created a completely different environment to which we had to reply. And I would add to this the 4 years of the Trump administration, which has, let's say, give us a sense that we were alone in the world, in the sense that we had not necessarily the traditional allies or the traditional support that we used to have before. And it is interesting what Ulrike was saying and the pool was saying about the need to create capabilities, even if we are not speaking necessarily about the defense element. And I think that is important because the element of security, I think it's more relevant than the element of defense in the thinking that we are developing. And to come to the point that the minister was making about the political will, the first thing is about assessing which are the threats that we are facing. Because if we have a common understanding of the threats, we have also maybe a sense that we need to respond collectively as European Union to these threats. And what is, I think it's the other element that we need to take into account is the complexity of the new scenarios that we are facing. We were accustomed to more conventional threats, and that's not gone away. See what is happening now at the border with Ukraine, the military build-up. So we have not, let's say, gone away with the conventional, but we are adding hybrid threats. And is what, again, we are also witnessing today at another border between Belarus, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, where there is an instrumentalization of the migrants. And it's not just that the migrants were there and they've been instrumentalized. They have, I mean, Lukashenko has gone to pick them up and brought them to the border. So it's disinformation, the other element, how the manipulation of information is brought into these processes. Again, what has happened also recently with the point of the migrants, but also what we have witnessed during the period of the health crisis, how it was presented. So, I mean, we are adding new new threats to old threats, new challenges to old challenges. And that's, I would say, is a little bit the sense of the strategic compass, to look at this more difficult and complex environment, at the complexity of these new threats, and trying to provide some answers to this. We can discuss more about the substance of which is in the paper, but I would say that the essence is to look at this new scenario and to see which are the instruments that we have at our disposal and what is missing in let's say, in this toolbox. And I think that there are, let's say, some elements about military capabilities that we need to develop, and it's a problem about how we do it, what we do it, how we finance these processes. But there is also another element of how we respond to the hybrid threats. And on this, I'm very much in agreement with the minister. We have to be much more proactive and not only reactive to the hybrid threats. I think that he's absolutely right that the instrument to fight against economic coercion is a very powerful instrument that the European Union wants to create. But at the same time, we cannot only speak about economic coercion, because there are many other element of coercion or of hidden coercion that are coming into the picture. So we need to be able to work along those lines. And then a final point, which I think is also important, is the projection of power or projection of the military power, which is another, let's say, challenge that we have, and then we go to the point of the resilience of our societies. How much are we ready to pay? How much is our society ready to take on them the price of challenging a number of behaviors? And all this complex picture, I think that we are not willing to work in a vacuum, so we want to look very carefully at our partners. NATO is clearly comes first in terms of organization with which we need to work on. I think that we need to be clear, the European Union will never become a military alliance. That's not the aspiration of the European Union, and that's, I would say, it's what NATO is, and it will remain the military alliance and the provider for the security architecture in Europe and beyond Europe. But at the same time, as I was saying, the challenges that we are facing are much more complex and require a much more sophisticated toolbox in order to reply to that. And that's where, paradoxically, European Union, the soft power of the European Union, our standards, norms, the way we were used to organize our work, comes extremely handy, because there are many elements of this toolbox that we have developed which are very relevant in order to fight these new hybrid or asymmetric threats. And that's why I think that there is a lot of complementarity between the two institutions. We always, when we speak about capabilities, we speak about the fact that they have to be complementary with NATO. I don't want to enter into kind of philosophical debate of who comes first, but I think that there is a level of mutual complementarity which is very interesting, and where the two organizations are already working very much together. I mean, not necessarily we know the problems that are linked to the different memberships of the two institutions, but at the same time there are a lot of very practical cooperation that is taking place, and it's not by chance that NATO is looking much more also into the hybrid element of the security dimension. So a lot of complementarity to work on. NATO on the one side, but don't forget also the United Nations. Don't forget the dimension of our member states who are not member of NATO, that needs to be part of this process as well, and needs to be to have full ownership of on this new security and defense element that we are building up. partnership with organizations, partnership with countries, and that's again, I mean, the US is the first to come into the line, and that's an interesting element that we finally managing to open a structured dialogue on security and defense, which will be, let's say, formally, which has been launched, but will be formally started by US and the EU at the beginning of next year. And it will be interesting to see how this element of checking our agendas and our instrument can work. And there again, I mean, if I speak about the US, but we cannot forget the other partners with which we have to develop it, and there is a long series of partners with which we need to work together in the future. So that's, to me, are the, let's say, the elements, the framework elements.
Thank you
and in
very
this
much.
context, we can discuss and develop our ideas.
Yeah. Let's go right into the discussion. And I want to stick with the compass for a moment, because French President Emmanuel Macron yesterday gave, I think, one of the longest press conferences in history. And he said on defense that he talked about the summit, of course, and that he wanted to build on the past 4 years when it comes to progress in the area of defense and security. And then he said he wanted to focus on operations during the presidency. So when I look at what the French have done in terms of operations lately, Takuba, also Emaso in the Strait of Hormuz, that was always outside the EU framework. So to me, it seemed that the French had lost some appetite to use the EU framework for their missions and operations. At the same time, I know that this has been a controversial topic in the compass. How ambitious should the EU be when it comes to the crisis management basket? Crisis management operations lately haven't been what they have been in the early 2000s. The EU has very much focused on training missions and training partners, and not really kind of massive boots on the ground, let's put it like this. So where should, listening to what Macron has said and the focus on operations, how can we make sure that operations like Takuba don't weaken the European Union's cohesion? And how can the EU be a more attractive platform than also for those kind of actions in the future? Or what should be the goal here for Europe? And whoever wants to start.
No, I think that there are several points that are relevant here. One is effectively the European Union missions have been essentially, mostly, non-executive. And there is a need in some cases, you mentioned Takuba, some contexts clearly for the capacity to have executive operations. And there the issue is, so are we going to do this at the level of 27? Are all of us going to be involved? I think that the strategic compass and the discussions that have been taking place over the last year have really been trying to say, how can we work in a smaller group, but as EU? And there have been, I think, there's been quite a lot of progress regarding Article 44, which is an article that says that we can create coalitions of the willing inside the EU to some extent, actually working as EU, and of course, very importantly, with a level of financial solidarity from the whole of the Union, from all 27, which enables a smaller group to go ahead and do what is desirable in terms of the European Union without all being involved. So I think that the strategic compass is quite good at pointing out the possibilities for engaging. For Takuba is explicitly mentioned. The European Intervention Initiative is not explicitly mentioned, but some of the formulations that are there seem to be thinking about it. And this is helping us to acknowledge a reality, which is that we're probably not going to have many circumstances in which we are going to be ready to go ahead as 27, but a number of countries that might not be willing to go ahead and be involved directly wouldn't mind if others did as well.
But it would still need unanimity, right? To activate Article 44 and to make the first decision would still be a decision at 27.
Yeah, there's been also a lot of discussion about the, what's the expression? The constructive abstention.
Abstention.
So there's no appetite for changing treaties. So we need to work with the flexibility that the current treaties provide us with. And I think there is space for exploring the possibilities of not everybody being involved, put it that way.
Thank you very much. Stefano, maybe you could link this also with the rapid deployment capacity. I think one of the most disputed terms in the Compass. I have heard a lot of colleagues from especially Central and Eastern Europe being completely critical with it, saying this is a duplication of NATO, we don't need this. But if we want to become more operational, I mean, we need to have some kind of deployment capacity, I think it is now. It was, I think, a rapid reaction force in the beginning, but however it will be called in the end. So do we need it in order to become more operational?
Yeah, yes, you're right, and it has been one of the, let's say, the issues that has attracted more attention and has been more discussed. And I think that the solution that we have come with, it's a sort of good balance, and it's also good balance for what the minister was saying before, in the sense that we are not creating a sort of a standby force to be used in whatever circumstances. So we are not thinking about creating a sort of European army, to be very clear. We are speaking about capacities which are can be used in specific scenario. That's the two elements that have to go together. We are looking at the fact not of having again a standby force, but on the contrary, that we bring together elements in order to perform tasks in specific circumstances on which we are agreeing. And that's maybe it's also an element that can facilitate the kind of consensus that is not always easy to find at 27, because you define a certain number of scenarios, and there is also in the treaty, I mean, when you look at the article on CFSP, CSDP, there are also some specific suggestions about what could be done. We have very much in mind, I don't know, evacuation processes or intervention of stabilization in a hostile environment. And so these are the elements that can help, let's say, creating the consensus, including the instrument of the constructive abstention, but we need to have a framework. We need to have a European framework. We need to, I'd say, to create also the capacity of the forces to work together. One other element which is very relevant in the Compass is the idea of having live exercises, which means that essentially these forces can really become operable on the ground. And we are speaking about, let's say, operations where not necessarily NATO is willing to intervene. I mean, once again, I mean, NATO is a clear scope geographically and not necessarily will be willing to intervene in every place, not necessarily the perception of the threats or the need on the ground will coincide perfectly. And that's why we need to have these capacities and we need to be able to use them effectively, once again, for the protection of our citizens.
But to play devil's advocate here, what do you say to critics that say, well, we had the battle groups forever, we never used them, so where is the difference here? Why is that now kind of the new kid in town, why is that going to fly? Where all the battle group kind of for years have been not used. So what is the difference? Well, the difference is that the battle groups were, again, a sort of more standby force. They were not linked to specific circumstances and scenarios. We are, and that's the point. We need political will, call it however you want to call it, or political will, or definition of a common threat that we need to face. That's the difference, and that's where there is a qualitative difference, because you do not have a simple, let's say, force which is there to be used, but you have a threat and a specific circumstance, and then you adjust your need and your forces to the responding to that threat. So the logic is different. It's you have a need and you have the means to perform the tasks that are necessary. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm convinced, but I'm at least hopeful.
I mean, it's the battle group. I think that there is always, and I was trying to say it before at the beginning, there is also a change in the scenario. We are not speaking only about conventional threats. We are not speaking only about, let's say, going on the ground and fighting. We are speaking also about, let's say, other kind of operations. But if you want to have the instrument, and if you want to create a common framework to that, if you want to have the strength of the European Union and not only that of a lead country to perform this task, then you need to have this kind of instruments. We will inspire ourselves also on the experience of the battle group, but we wanted to avoid the same kind of problems that the battle group have encountered. Looking at Carl, because I mean he's nodding his head.
Stefano. I'll give the word to Carl in a minute, but I want to come to the United States first, and I want to come to you, João, because I mean, there have been signals from the United States forever that they want to see a stronger European commitment, stronger European engagement. But there was often the impression at the European side that it was primarily about buying American weapons and then doing more of what the Americans want us to do. That is, I mean, a bit of a stereotype, but still. So now the Biden administration, after Afghanistan and AUKUS and some hiccups in the transatlantic relationship, they have signaled that they are basically willing also to support efforts in an EU framework. They understand that we need a strong European defense industry. So how hopeful are you that basically this structured dialogue that will be kicked off next year will make a difference? So how hopeful are you that we are able, with the Biden administration, to take this as an encouragement and to really make a significant leap forward as Europeans?
Well, I think that it's a very important philosophical step that has happened in Washington. It remains to be seen how effective. We're talking about 2022. Let's see how this structural dialogue on defense and security actually operates. But I think it is a major step, because the term burden sharing in the transatlantic relationship has been unfortunately captured by the notion of everybody having to go to 2% of spending of their GDP on military. And as you say, buying American weapons actually helps a lot on that. Burden sharing has to mean a lot more than that. It has to be about creating circumstances for governance of peace and stability in which the European Union has a major role to play. And the kind of new threats that Stefano was mentioning with respect to hybrid and the cyber and all the resilience issues that we are now talking about, all of these in fact, the European Union is much more well equipped than NATO to deal with. So from the United States to say, let's talk with the European Union on these issues, of so-called burden sharing, beyond the financial part, is a very important step. And it's relevant that this is happening beyond the NATO platform. NATO is a fundamental part of the transatlantic relationship, but it's not everything in the transatlantic relationship. And for Washington, it's a major step to say, okay, we can talk to the Europeans outside of the NATO context, because there are a number of issues which go beyond NATO concerns. It seems like obvious, but there has been enormous resistance to this in Washington until now. So I have expectations here with respect to that process, and I know that it's still going to require, not everybody in Washington is convinced, and so it's going to require, I think, quite a lot of work on both our sides over the next year or two, but it's a fundamental part.
Stefano, we have talked forever that we have these two processes, compass and concept, and that we need to link them closely together. My impression now is that we have talked a lot about this, but the actual processes are not very well connected. There is not very much exchange of ideas and interaction. Am I wrong? Is this process better coordinated than I think?
Well, I mean, two different organizations, two different decision processes, two different memberships, so we cannot, let's say, say there is a complete superposition of the two processes. But at the end of the day, I think that there is a lot of discussion going on, and there is a lot of attention that each one is that is giving to the other process. So I think that there is an element of I would say coordination between the two processes. And it's not by chance that we are talking about, let's say, a sort of a cycle, which will start with the strategic compass till March, and then with the strategic compact till the summit in Madrid. So there is I think that there is a degree of continuity, and this dialogue that we have started with the US is also part of the story. I fully agree with the Minister about the fact that the relationship with the US, and including on security and defense, goes beyond NATO, and there are other elements that come into the picture. So we have to take all these elements together. But I would say that there is a degree of understanding. If you look at the number of crossed briefings that we have had between NATO and the EU in the last year, it's quite impressive. I mean, we are really talking a lot, and we are talking a lot on everything, not only on the purely military dimension and defense dimension, but also on the perception of the threats, on the common awareness, and that's very helpful to generate this coherence.
When I think about NATO and EU, I think it's like on an online dating platform where kind of the perfect match on paper and theory, yeah, both work very well together. It's the perfect couple, and in reality, kind of the first date is a complete disaster. But maybe not. Well, I mean, that's exaggeration. I think we got much better, and we are preparing now the third joint declaration. So there is hope too. And I promise that this is not going to be too dark. But now I want to open the floor, and my first speaker is Carl Bildt. Yeah, I make a list and give you all the possibility to come in.
No, of course, I've been around for too long. I don't know where, is Erkki here? Erkki Tuomioja? He was here. He was here yesterday. I was going to refer to the Helsinki headline goals. Because that's where it all...
He's here, he's just sitting there.
Erkki could tell us about the Helsinki headline goals. 60,000 men, if I remember it, ready to be within a couple of months in order to intervene all over the world. That's where it started, more than 20 years ago. And then we went from that to the Petersburg tasks. That was an endless theological debate on what could be done and not done. And then we created the battle groups and spent a lot of energy on that, never to be used. And it all have been fairly theoretical exercises, while we have been rather reluctant to ever use them. We have been, Stefano, we have been doing these compositive things. We did the Chad operation in 2007. We didn't use the battle groups. We created something. There was the same in Central African Republic, not very successful, but anyhow. But we have been extremely hesitant in the concrete situations. And I don't think this will ever sort itself out until we get down into the mud, to use that particular phrase. It was only really the Bosnian experience, good or bad, both, that made the Brits and the French think about working together in really muddy situations and start to learn things. So, with due respect to all of the papers coming out of Brussels, we all read them with great respect and admiration and adoration. It's only by doing things that we can learn. And one of the things, one of my very many failures in this respect was that I was trying to advocate for a long time that we should take the simple step of the battle groups, of just exercising them once a year. We could, wherever they're coming from, whichever country, deploy them on an exercise every year to somewhere. Bosnia is a good place. There's a lot of empty space in Bosnia these days. You can easily deploy a battle group to train the logistics, the deployment, the command and control, in order to demonstrate that we actually can do something apart from producing papers. But anyhow, I hope this is done. Second, on defense industry, where sort of EU does have a role. Here, good things are done. I'm not going to say anything. Good things are done. But we are still heading into a major clash. heading into the future, we have 2 huge European defense projects, well, much bigger than anything else on the cards. One is the French-German air dominance project, the DCAF. Huge amounts of money. The second is the Brits and the Italians and certainly the Swedes. And these are the, without comparison, biggest defense industry project that's on the table of Europe. And we have 2 of them.
Mm-hmm.
We have 2 of them.
But there were rumors of a merger recently.
There might be rumors of the merger, but I mean, have you talked to Dassault about that? It's going to be extremely tricky. But the fact that we have this illustrates the difficulty that we have. And to add to it, we got the Brits. And the Brits have more than 30% of the defense research capabilities of Europe. We should be honest, we can't do serious things without the Brits. MBDA, probably the most competitive defense industry we have in Europe, 30% to 35% British. Airbus, which is a major defense company in DCAF as well, 30-35% British. Leonardo, Italian, but substantial British as well. We need to, at some point in time, if we're going to be competitive on the global market, sort it out with the Brits. Now, I'm saying this, and I don't think anyone would disagree. And we all know where the problems are. But I think we need to devote somewhat greater intellectual and political resources to trying to sort out that. Because the Brits are, after all, and we see that in the European Intervention Force, and we see that it's difficult to do really serious things long term if we don't have the Brits on board. And there might be some sensible Brits around, I don't know.
Thank you, Carl. I'll take Erki next, and so later then we discuss what to do with the battle groups, how to deal with the reluctant, let's say, UK, not really ready to engage with the EU, and maybe also about kind of the diverse European defense industry and how to align this better. And Erki,
thank
please.
you. I asked for the floor in reaction to the term coalition of the willing. It is something, of course, which we have seen and which is possible, but every time European countries act as a coalition of the willing, it indirectly also weakens the EU, because we would like in Finland to see a stronger EU using the EU institutions and all of us working within the EU institutions. And we know that this is not possible because we do not have QMV in foreign and security policy. I don't think that we are going to see QMV in any foreseeable future because it so directly affects the national interest and sovereignty of member states, so that we cannot really count on this being a fact. But it may be easier if we use it in combination with constructive abstention, taking decisions by QMV, but recognizing that there may be countries who cannot take part in that decision and who can still refrain from blocking the EU from acting. I think that we have a very strange situation today where, particularly in the United Nations and the Middle East, we have been blocked by 1 or 2 countries from even repeating the statements and positions that we have had for years. And this is really demeaning. The other point I want to make is about sanctions. It has not been mentioned, but sanctions are about the only tool in our toolbox which we use when something nasty happens in the world. But I think that our sanctions policy are far from being smart sanctions. I think they are rather dumb sanctions. And it is a sort of knee-jerk reaction every time Russia, China, or I would like to see also Saudi Arabia being sanctioned in the same way for the same reasons, but that has never been the case so far. But every time something happens, it's a knee-jerk reaction very much to our domestic audiences, and we need to put someone on the sanctions list. And I think that banning people who we see as being responsible for human rights violations or war crimes from entering the EU is the wrong solution. In fact, we should encourage them to enter the EU, where if we have sufficient evidence, we can put them on trial in courts for human rights violations. I think this is the way we should treat these personal sanctions. But otherwise, the whole sanctions regime needs to be looked at because we never discuss what is the exit strategy, what do we expect to receive from it. It's just the feel-good factor.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for cutting you off, but coming back to my online dating platform, think of this as some speed dating exercise. So, the lady in red, please. And then I give it back to you both, and then we do a second round.
I have a brief question to the Minister. You talked in the beginning about the maritime security as one of the priorities to include. Is Black Sea included? Is the safety of navigation and the Black Sea security included? Or is it predominantly for the Mediterranean and the Northern Sea?
It's a very concrete question. Thank you very much. So we have exercises for the battle groups. We have European defense industry, the UK, the question coalition of the willing, do they undermine EU cohesion, QMV, the sanctions question, and maritime security and the Black Sea. That's a lot. Coming back to the speed dating, that is also, I think, valid for you. So whoever, I think you start.
I don't know, maybe to Carl on what you were saying, you're right. I mean, it's the headlines goal and the battle group were the decided in a certain moment. It was the time when Europe had never been safer, more prosperous. It was the time of the Solana doctrine. I mean, we are speaking about another world, in spite of the fact. So I think that the point is that the threat has changed enormously. The country, the world is much more fractured and much more polarized. And we do not have the traditional alliances that we had to use before. So it's a different, that's why I'm insisting on the point of the perception of the threats and the need for member states, speaking about European Union, to get their acts together. And that's why I've put the strategic compass also in the context of the multi-crisis that the European Union has gone through. I'm not saying that we will succeed, I mean, but I'm saying that qualitatively we are speaking of a completely different world compared with the past. And if we can manage to get to this, to have a sort of shared analysis and awareness that we need to respond to this and that our security is in danger, maybe we will have something different. And maybe we will come to the point where instead of going alone, we will go together. Then the mechanism will be complicated. Will we manage to get the support of the 27 with all the systems, with the constructive abstention and so on? Again, to be seen. If we consider collectively that the threat is for everybody, maybe yes. And maybe we will also be able to have the common costs, and maybe we will be able to go for a live exercise and to get really serious from that point of view. So again, I mean, we are providing a different story. The headline goals were coming on abstraction. The strategic compass is based on a common threat analysis, which we have agreed at 27. So, I mean, I hope that qualitative will be different. Industry, I agree with you, that's a key point. It's not only about putting together our acts, but also financing. I was saying this in a less clear way. I will be even more clear. That will cost. It will cost a lot of money if we want to give us the capabilities. And so we have to find also the financial instrument to do that. And that's, if we put that on the top of all that we have to do for the green transition, it will be a huge impact on our budgets. Finally, with the Brits, you are right there too. It takes two to tango. As in NATO, there are things which are going under the radar screen, and I would say there is a lot of talks that takes in place. Then, unfortunately, when we go to the political level, we are still stuck in this riot that we have. Hopefully, we will be there, and then we can speak about, if you want, sanctions and other things. But I think that that's important to make a qualitative differentiation between where we are now and where we used to be 20 years ago.
João.
Yes, I don't know if the analogy of division of labor works with speed dating online, but I'm very happy to subscribe to what Stefano has mentioned, so I can talk a little bit about a couple of the other points. On the defense industry, I think that there is no European defense identity without a defense industry. This is a fundamental part. It's not so well appreciated, well understood by our public opinions, but this is the work that is being done with PESCO and with the European Defence Fund. is essential for us to be able to have a proper European defense identity. And there's a lot of work, and the points that the examples that Carl Bildt has pointed out are relevant. But on the other hand, we have come a very long way actually in a few years. We need to continue in a very focused manner to be working on European champions. And European champions doesn't necessarily mean a single behemoth in a given field. It can actually work in terms of network, which I think would be more appropriate to the European panorama. But we do need to be focusing on that. The question of the involvement of the UK, I hope, is a question that we will not be so relevant in 4 or 5 years' time, in the sense that we will be working naturally with the UK. There are divergences as the UK seeks to carve out a new vision of itself in the world, but essentially, you know, the United Kingdom is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to drift off into the middle of the Atlantic. It's not going to go east. It's still there. Its basic interests and values are completely compatible with ours. We're going through a difficult time. I hope that in a few years it will be possible for the sensible people to prevail and for us to be working much more closely together.
Maybe on QMV?
On the QMV, no, I agree with Erki's point about exploring the possibilities, being creative with the options that already exist in the treaties. I think that's in fact the only way to go, because QMV is not going to be happening anytime soon. So, but there is scope, and there is, I would say there is availability on the part of the member states to be choosing that, even those that have quite different foreign policies because they are neutral, because of different circumstances. On sanctions, you know, there's this idea sanctions don't work, and you know, there are many examples. But when you say sanctions don't work, you have to ask the question: well, what were they meant to produce? And I think it's absolutely right to say very often sanctions, they actually do work because they keep public opinion happy, and that is often what they're for. That is why they're enacted. But as a foreign policy instrument, yes, they have been hopeless. And we do need to be operating in a manner that goes beyond saying we have a problem, let's slam some sanctions on it and it will be solved, because there is no effectiveness in that kind of approach. So it's about having smart sanctions, and also about being honest with respect to what we want to achieve with the sanctions. And there was a question on the Black Sea. I think that this is actually a very specific circumstance where we do have to be working with NATO, and there is no need for overlap where issues are covered. Romania, we have EU countries that are bordering on the Black Sea. It's part of our geostrategic environment as European Union, but we're not the only players there, and I don't know if there is actual need for the European Union. In the Gulf of Guinea, we absolutely do have a European Union need to be present. In the Black Sea, I don't think that's the case at the moment.
I think we have time for a second quick round. I have 2, 3 already. Yeah. In that order, the 3 gentlemen over here. And whoever feels encouraged of you to ask about the Indo-Pacific and kind of priorities, neighborhood versus more expeditionary ideas, is highly encouraged to ask that question as well.
Thank you. Very briefly, 2 questions are already prepared, unfortunately. The one is nearly the Black Sea is the question of Turkey. Turkey is a very difficult partner. If it's a partner, sometimes it's an opponent. Is there any strategy, any way how to involve Turkey strongly in that kind of strategic dialogue? It's not only about the Black Sea, it's about the Eastern Mediterranean, it's about gas, it's about security. So I think my question would be in that direction on Turkey. And the second one, Minister, you mentioned Africa. There should be much more spoken with Africans. What do you mean exactly? For me, for example, European forces are defending our interest in fight against the jihadists, but very often the governments in the country themselves don't have a real concept how to fight against jihadism. So is this an issue, or maybe you could be a bit more specific on that?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Andris Strasts, I'm a council member from Latvia, so you can imagine the direction of my question. Secretary General mentioned Trump administration and how Europeans felt abandoned. I must say that we in the Baltics and Poland never felt abandoned by the Trump administration. Actually, Trump administration did even more than Obama administration for us in the framework of NATO. And I think the key difference is that we spend 2% or more of GDP on defense. And my question thus is, isn't this strategic compass talk actually a kind of actual reluctance by certain Western capitals, Western European capitals, sorry, to spend the 2% of GDP on defense, and as such it's just a kind of bullshit bingo document with which certain Western European capitals cover their reluctance just to spend enough on defense. And if they were willing to spend enough on defense, meaning that at least 2% of GDP, then there would not be need for the bullshit bingo document, because then you could do that within the framework of NATO.
Let's agree on paper tiger instead of using other words. Gustav Gressel, my colleague. And as I said, if he's not asking the question, I'll ask you about regional priorities. How much should we focus on our neighborhood, and how expeditionary should we be in our aim as Europeans, not only inside the EU?
Okay.
Sorry, Gustav, for sneaking in my question.
No. You can ask this question, because I was rather triggered by the comment that sanctions are basically for domestic consumption and it's more about us than about them. 4 days ago, we had Russian-Indian defense cooperation talks, and the Indians wanted to acquire the T-14 Armata tank. And the Russians told them, we are very sorry, this tank will start serial production only after 2024, the earliest, because due to sanctions from the European side, we lack the battlefield management system, we lack the optical sights, we lack the fire control computer, we lack critical components for our active defense system, and we can't produce the bloody tank. So each tank not produced by them because of our sanctions is also a tank that we don't have to deter on our eastern flank. So said that, there is a relentless effort by the Russians to bypass sanctions through bogus brass plate enterprises that try to buy subcomponents, that try to buy special materials, to set them up in insuspicious third countries to funnel around this stuff. In Germany, there are several trials ongoing against enterprises engaged in this kind of stuff, which brings me to the thing of enforcement. Strategic documents are always nice when they announce such things, but control enforcement is becoming an increasingly issue within a very heterogeneous EU of the 27 and very heterogeneous rule of law states within these countries.
I think that's closely related also to the paper tiger argument. So we have Turkey, we have, what do you mean by we need to focus on Africa more? Is that more training and equipping, EUTM missions? What does it mean concretely? We have, is the strategic compass mainly a distraction, a paper tiger, also a document where kind of member states don't really buy in, as we have seen with other EU documents? So how to make sure that this kind of, that you have some enforcement mechanism, if that is possible.
You first now.
Okay, well, if I'm first, then in terms of division of labor, I'll leave Turkey to you.
Thank you.
On Africa, we're engaged at the moment in Central African Republic. We're engaged in Mali, and I think that we are failing to be consequential in terms of understanding that it is only the regional, the local dynamics that is really going to make a difference in those countries. Our instruments for deal are just too blunt. We can make a difference in terms of training capacities, and the work that is going on there is to a degree valid, but it is not politically very relevant. It's not capable of enacting political change. And for me, the solution to that is really to empower ECOWAS, the other regional actors. Of course, in Central African case, it's a weaker organization, because they are the ones that have a fine understanding of the local dynamics. Their interests are the same as ours, and we are not doing sufficient in engaging with them in order to say, you know, we have the muscle, and we can put it at your disposal. So I think there's plenty we could be doing in terms of engaging more closely with Africans. On the document being a paper tiger, I beg to differ. I do think that it can make a difference. Of course, in the end, it will be about actually putting it into operation. But there is plenty in terms of our security environment that goes beyond NATO. And therefore, it does make plenty of sense to be operating in a context which is the idea of the European defense identity is a valid one, beyond the NATO concerns. So I would not say, and in fact it is very ineffective in getting us out of our NATO obligations. I would be a little bit less cynical and more hopeful in respect to the consequences of the strategic concept. And yes, I'm happy to admit that I was caricaturizing to a certain extent with respect to deriding sanctions. They can be effective. My favorite example is actually how we managed to impede the execution of a number of people over a number of years in the United States, people who were subjected to the death penalty by sanctions that we imposed to an ally in a different context, but it's a fundamental European value. And it worked. And there are cases where sanctions can be quite smart. One of the things that we do need to be doing, though, is working on a Europeanization of what are the rules for our exports. If we are going to be working in terms of a European defense industry, or defense industries, then we also need to have a homogenization of the rules that trigger ban on defense exports, because so many goods nowadays are produced with little pieces from all over the part, and if you have one piece which has an export ban, then the whole thing doesn't work. So
that's good news for the German government, because it's in the coalition treaty, kind of this aim to work on
Wunderbar.
European export rules. I don't know if the French will be so pleased, though, but we'll see. Stefano, could you also come back to the question on the regional reach, if you want?
I have, let's say, 3 questions to answer. First, Turkey. I mean, I think that, to be very honest, we have tried everything possible to have Turkey on a constructive path. But again, it takes 2 to tango. I mean, we couldn't have been more open, forthcoming, understanding the role of Turkey and what they represent, but they have also to choose to be with us. And I mean, and if they do, we have all the interest in the world to go ahead with them, to the point that we have never stopped theoretically our enlargement negotiations, that we continue to consider Turkey a very important power. Again, I would put the ball very much in the court of Ankara at this stage. On the point of the NATO strategic compass, I also beg to disagree, and strongly, to be honest. Because the problem is that, you are confusing defense with security in a broader term. NATO is not intervening at the border with Belarus when there is an instrumentalization of migrants. We are doing it. We are coming with our instruments. NATO is not intervening when it comes to the crisis in Belarus. We are doing it. And it's rightly so. NATO is a military alliance. We are speaking about something different qualitatively about what we do. And it's interesting that NATO is asking us to do more in the context of hybrid and the context of asymmetric threats. The point of the spending, and I was saying it before, we will need to spend if we want to be, if we want to get to the point of having our capacities really workable, then we will need to spend money. But I think that Jana was rightly saying at a certain point the issue of Trump was not about spending money, it was about getting our money to buy American stuff. And that's another story, I mean, to be very honest. So I'm very much in favor of having a very strong cooperation with NATO, and I do believe that we do have the best possible cooperation with NATO, but I don't think that NATO is solving all our problems, all the problems of our security. NATO is not going to intervene in Africa, is not going to intervene for the evacuation of European citizens, and so that's something that we need to do ourselves. On the priorities, yeah, I mean, I think that once again, I mean, I would go more for the threats and the kind of threats that are developing than the region. You may have threats coming from Far East Asia that are with cyber attacks that are very complicated for us and that are making our life impossible. If you are trying to hack, I don't know, a system, a health system, or a system of our cities, or of our administration, it doesn't mean that it has to come from the neighbors. It can come from very far away, and we have to be able to face that kind. So I think that we need also to change mentally our structure, that we are not speaking about what is dangerous is only what is in our immediate neighbor. Can come from much further away. Can be from Afghanistan. I mean, migration flows can come into, or terrorist attacks can come from very far. So I think that certainly we will look at our neighbors. There is no doubt about that. But the idea of saying we have to concentrate on this and we have to forget about the rest, I think that would be a mistake. And I think that there is a very strong link between the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific. I think that we really need to link the two elements and to start thinking in terms, well, sorry to repeat always this concept of threats and challenges, but that's the real point. We have to be able to have a sort of a global alliance against this.
Thank you very much, João and Stefano. We went way into your coffee break. I blame that entirely on you because you were late this morning and I wanted to use the entire hour for this discussion because I really thoroughly enjoyed it very much. I thank you. I thank the audience for questions. We will start again at 10:30 and have a debate about the security compact with Eastern Europe here in this room. And if you want to talk about green tech in the other breakout session, that's outside. So enjoy your coffee and please join me in giving a round of applause for our speakers.